She was 27 years old and 4 months a widow when she paid $1 and the back taxes on a lighthouse keeper's cottage on a rock at the end of a peninsula in down East Maine. The roof leaked. The well had gone bad in 1996. The Fresnel lens at the top of the tower had not been turned on since the Coast Guard automated the light in 1978. Petty Officer Caleb Wren had died on the 2nd of June on a stretch of Route 1 between Ellsworth and Hancock when a logging truck crossed the center line at 6 in the morning, and Faye Wren had buried her husband on a Saturday with a small fold of paper from the chaplain in her coat pocket, and no plan for what came next. But what nobody knew was that behind the brass collar of that old Fresnel lens, in a compartment built into the lamp room by a keeper who had stopped trusting the Coast Guard's filing system, was a leather journal that covered 17 years of one man's attention to the same square mile of ocean, and that the journal would take Faye Wren a winter and a spring to read, and the rest of her life to understand. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Faye had not grown up near the ocean. She was born in a small inland town in central Pennsylvania, the kind of place where the closest thing to salt water was the brine in a mason jar of pickled beets in her grandmother's pantry. Her father was a high school chemistry teacher who built model boats on a workbench in the basement during the long Pennsylvania winters. He built them slowly and without any particular reason, the way men of his generation built things, with a small radio playing the Pirates game from a shelf above the bench and a cup of coffee gone cold on a coaster shaped like the state of Maine. The coaster had been a gift from a brother who had moved to Bar Harbor in the late 1970s and stayed. Her father had never been to visit him. He kept the coaster anyway. Faye watched her father build those boats from the time she was old enough to climb onto the wooden stool beside his bench. She watched him plank a cedar hull and lay the deck and sand the rails and rig the masts with thread he had unwound from a spool her mother kept in the sewing kit. She watched him hold a brass cleat under a magnifying lamp and file the edge with a needle file the size of a pencil lead. She did not ask him why he was building boats he would never sail. She understood without asking that there are things a person makes because the making itself is the point. She also understood that her father, who had grown up the youngest of 7 on a hill farm outside Lock Haven and had taken the chemistry job because it paid steady and offered summers, had wanted to do something else with his life that he had not done. She did not know what. She knew the boats were close to it. She met Caleb Wren in the summer she was 23 at a small marine supply store in Bar Harbor, where she had taken a seasonal job after college because she had a degree in environmental science and no idea what to do with it. Caleb was an enlisted man in the United States Coast Guard, 25 years old, stationed at Southwest Harbor on the cutter Bridle. He had come into the store on a Tuesday morning to pick up a length of 3-strand twisted nylon and a fid for splicing it, and he had stayed for 40 minutes talking to Faye about the difference between marine epoxy and the cheaper hardware store kind. He came back the next week. He came back the week after that. By August, he had asked her to dinner. By October, he had asked her to stay through the winter. She had stayed. They were married the following May in a small ceremony at a congregational church in Lemoyne, with Faye's parents driving up from Pennsylvania in the Buick her father had owned for 19 years, and Caleb's mother flying in from a small town in eastern Oregon where she had raised 3 sons on a teacher's pension after their father had walked out in 1991. Caleb's mother stayed a week. She left Faye a wooden recipe box she had been keeping for 30 years, and a quiet observation that her son had a way of choosing places that asked things of him, and people too, and that she was glad he had finally chosen well on both counts. They rented a small cape on the backside of Lemoyne for $112 a week in the off-season and $400 in summer. Caleb worked the bridle and then the smaller 47-foot motor lifeboat out of Southwest Harbor. Faye worked at the marine supply store and then, the second year, at a small non-profit in Ellsworth that monitored watershed health in the Frenchman Bay drainage. She drove a 15-year-old Subaru with a hatch that no longer latched and a passenger seat where Caleb's spare uniform hung from a hook in a dry cleaning bag, because the cottage had no closet on the porch side. They had been married 22 months and 1 week when the logging truck crossed the center line. The driver had been awake for 19 hours. He had been hauling pulpwood for a mill in Old Town, north of Bangor, and he had taken a second run he should not have taken because his daughter was applying to a state college and the deposit was due. He survived the accident. Caleb did not. The state police came to the door of the rented cape at 7:15 in the morning. Faye had been in the kitchen, pouring coffee from the percolator into a stainless steel travel mug for Caleb's shift. She held the mug in her hand when she opened the door. She was still holding it when the trooper finished speaking. She did not remember setting it down. The funeral was on a Saturday at the Congregational Church where they had been married. Caleb's mother flew back from Oregon and stayed 3 days and asked Faye, on the morning she left, whether Faye intended to stay in Maine. Faye said she did not know. Caleb's mother nodded and said that the choice would come and would feel like a choice and would not exactly be one, and that the only thing to do when it came was to listen to whichever part of her was not afraid. She left a small envelope on the kitchen counter with $500 in cash and a note that said, "Whatever you decide, this is yours." Faye put the envelope in her father's old chemistry textbook on the shelf above the bed and did not open it. The cottage came to her through a man named Eldon Yates, who ran a small law office above the hardware store in Ellsworth, and who had, 20 years earlier, handled the modest estate of a Coast Guard widow named Marjorie Marchant, the daughter of the last full-time keeper of Blackstone Point Light, on the rocky stub of peninsula 6 miles north of Hancock. Marjorie had outlived her husband and her father both, and had left the cottage in trust to be transferred, at a nominal fee plus accumulated taxes, to the next person who came to Eldon Yates's office and said the words she had specified in the will. The words were not difficult. They were simply, "I am the next one." And Eldon Yates had been waiting 11 years for someone to come in and say them. Faye did not say them. She did not know about the words at all. What happened was simpler. She went to Yates's office in late September to settle a small matter about Caleb's pension, and she sat in the wooden chair on the visitor side of his desk for 10 minutes while he found the right folder. And at some point during those 10 minutes, she said to the lamp on the corner of his desk, because she could not say it to Eldon Yates and could not say it to anyone, that she could not stay in the rented cape and could not go back to Pennsylvania and did not know where she was supposed to go. Eldon Yates heard her. He set the folder down. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "There is a cottage at Blackstone Point that I have been holding for the right person. I will not pretend I know whether you are her, but the criteria the previous owner left were not technical, and if you would like to drive out and see it, I will give you the key." She drove out the next morning. Hancock is a small town along Route 1, the kind of town that has a gas station, a post office, a general store, and a town landing where the lobster boats tie up in summer. From Hancock, you take a narrow road that follows the contour of the coast for 4 miles, past 2 saltwater farms and a Methodist cemetery, until the road becomes a single graded lane that runs out along a finger of granite into the Gulf. The lane ends at a chain-link gate that had been propped open with a stone. Beyond the gate, on the highest point of the peninsula, stood the keeper's cottage and the tower. The tower was a stub of whitewashed brick, about 38 feet high, with a black cap and a single dark window in the lamp room near the top. The cottage stood beside it, attached by a covered walkway that had been built in 1911 to spare the keeper the wind in winter. Cottage and tower together formed a small L on the headland, weathered to the color of bone, surrounded on 3 sides by the open Atlantic. Faye parked the Subaru on the gravel turnaround and got out and stood for a long time in the cold September wind. The ocean was the dark grey it gets in Maine in the autumn, slate and pewter and bottle green, where the swells folded over the ledge that ran south from the point. A flock of eider ducks was working a patch of broken water about a quarter-mile out. There was no sound but the wind and the water, and every 12 seconds the small mechanical bleat of the modern aluminium mast beacon that the Coast Guard had bolted to the rock 30 yards from the old tower in 1978, when they had taken the keeper out of the keeper's house and left the keeper's house to the keeper's heirs. The cottage was small, 640 square feet, according to the deed, single-story, with a covered porch facing the leeward side and 4 small windows facing the sea. The cedar shingles on the south wall had gone grey-silver in places and black-green in others, where the moss had taken hold. The chimney was sound. The roof was visibly bad along the ridge, 2 courses of asphalt shingle peeled back where a winter storm had taken them, and no one had come to replace them. The granite stoop was solid. The brass doorknob, when she tried it with the key, turned cleanly. The door swung open into a small kitchen with a wood-burning cook stove against the north wall, and a soapstone sink under the seaward window, and a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling on a length of cloth-wrapped wire that had not been touched, by the look of it, in 50 years. The air inside was cold and smelled of cedar and wood smoke, and the salt that gets into everything on a Maine point. Faye walked from the kitchen through a low doorway into the keeping room, which had a small fireplace and a built-in settle along one wall, and a window seat in the bay that looked east across the open ocean. She walked from there into the small back hall that connected the cottage to the tower by way of the covered walkway. The walkway was 11 steps long. At the end of it was a heavy wooden door, painted Coast Guard green, with a black iron latch and a small hand-lettered sign that read, in faded paint, "Keeper's Entrance." She lifted the latch. The door opened with the slow weight of something that had been built to hold against 100 years of weather. She stepped through. She was standing at the base of the tower. The interior of the tower was a single round room, about 12 feet across, with a cast-iron spiral stair winding up the inside wall to a small landing at the top. The walls were whitewashed brick. The floor was painted concrete, worn smooth by generations of boots. A coal scuttle sat in the corner. A canvas raincoat hung on a peg by the door, grey with age, the wool collar still holding the shape of the man's neck that had worn it. Faye stood at the base of the stair and looked up. The afternoon light came down the spiral in a soft column. She did not climb the stair that day. She closed the door of the tower and walked back through the covered walkway to the cottage and stood in the keeping room and felt the floor under her boots and the cold air on her face, and something she could not name shifted in her chest, the way the tide shifts when it has finished its run and begun, very slowly, to come back the other way. She drove back to Ellsworth that evening and met Eldon Yates at his office at 6 o'clock. She signed the papers. She paid the back taxes from Caleb's small pension, $840 even. She paid the dollar separately, in cash, from a coffee can she had brought from the rented Cape, which was a coffee can her father had given her the summer she turned 16, with a folded note inside that said, "For the things worth saving." She had been adding small bills to it for 11 years. Eldon Yates wrote her a receipt for the dollar on a half sheet of his own letterhead and signed it and dated it the 29th of September and slid it across the desk and said, "You will need a man named Royston Mears. He lives on the next point south. He used to run the small craft restoration shop at the Penobscot Marine Museum before he retired. He has been keeping an eye on the cottage for 30 years. He has a key. I would call him tomorrow." Faye called him from the payphone outside the general store in Hancock the next morning. Royston answered on the second ring. He had a slow, down-east voice, and an even slower way of using it. He said he would meet her at the cottage at 1 o'clock and bring a thermos of coffee and a roll of plastic sheeting for the bad section of roof. He arrived at 12:45 in a dark green pickup truck that had been new the year Caleb was born, with 2 ladders strapped to the rack and a canvas tool bag in the bed that looked, even from across the turnaround, as if it had not been replaced in any of its parts since Royston had bought it sometime in the middle 1970s. He was a tall man in his early 70s, narrow-shouldered, with white hair cut close to the skull, and the kind of face that the Maine coast produces in men who have spent 40 winters there, weathered around the eyes and quiet around the mouth. He shook her hand with a hand that felt like cold leather. He did not say he was sorry about her husband. He said, "I knew Marjorie Marchant. I helped her father move a stove into that kitchen in 1969. The cottage is sound where it counts. The roof can wait 2 weeks if we tarp it today. The well is the first thing." He paused. Then he said, "Have you been up the stair yet?" Faye said she had not. Royston nodded slowly. He looked out at the ocean for a long moment. He said, "There is no hurry. The lamp room has been waiting since 1978. It will wait another day." Then he carried his ladder around to the south side of the cottage and started laying out the plastic sheeting on the granite stoop, weighting the corners with stones from the wall. Faye carried the second ladder. They did not speak again until the tarping was done and the coffee in the thermos had cooled to the temperature you can drink in a hurry on a Maine afternoon when the wind is coming up. She slept in the cottage that first night. Royston had brought her a folding cot and a wool blanket and a small kerosene lantern from his own house, and had shown her how to lay a fire in the cook stove and how to bank it for the night so the kitchen would still hold heat at 4 in the morning. He had also brought her a paper sack from the general store in Hancock, with a loaf of bread, a small wedge of cheese, a tin of sardines, and a quart of clean water in a mason jar from his own well, which he said he would refill until hers could be brought back in the spring. He left at dusk. Faye lay on the cot in the keeping room and listened to the wind and the water and the regular 12-second pulse of the aluminium mast beacon out on the rock, and felt the cottage hold its small warmth against the night. She slept in a way she had not slept in 4 months. She did not dream of Caleb. She did not dream at all. She woke at 6 to the sound of the foghorn out on Petit Manan and the gulls working the tide line, and she lay for a long time in the grey light and listened to the cottage breathing around her the way an old wooden house breathes when the temperature shifts and the joints settle. She climbed the tower stair at 7:15. 22 iron treads, worn slightly cupped in the centre where 100 years of keepers had set their boots in the same place, going up and coming down. The stair ended at a small wooden landing and a hatch in the ceiling. She lifted the hatch. She climbed through. She stood in the lamp room. The Fresnel lens stood in the center of the room on its iron pedestal, a glass beehive about 4 feet tall, the prisms still mostly clean, the brass collar at the base tarnished to the color of an old penny. The room was glassed on 5 sides, with the heavy panes the Lighthouse service used to ship up from a foundry in Pittsburgh. The 6th side was the small door that led out onto the catwalk. The morning light came through the seaward panes and broke against the prisms of the lens and threw a slow-turning rainbow across the painted ceiling. Faye stood beside the lens and put her hand on the brass collar. The brass was cold under her palm. She felt the small weight of something inside it shift very slightly, the way a coin moves in a tin when the tin is tilted. She looked closer. The collar was not a single piece. There was a seam she had not noticed at first, a thin line where the brass had been cut and rejoined with a hinge no larger than a thumbnail, hidden in the engraved scrollwork. The seam ran the full circumference of the collar. Whatever was inside the collar had been put there by someone who did not want the Coast Guard to find it. Faye took her hand off the brass. She did not open the collar that morning. She stood in the lamp room for a long time, with the rainbow turning across the ceiling and the foghorn on Petit Manan calling out across the gulf. And she thought about her husband. And she thought about her father, building boats in a basement in Pennsylvania. And she thought about a man named Marjorie's father, whom she had never met and would never meet, but who had built a hidden compartment into a brass collar in a lighthouse lamp room on a rock on the coast of Maine, and had left whatever was inside it for whoever came next. She climbed back down the stair. She closed the hatch. She put a small piece of folded paper on the windowsill of the lamp room to remind herself which way she had left the latch turned. And she went back down to the kitchen and put the kettle on the cook stove and stood at the soapstone sink and watched the gulls working the rip out past the ledge while the water came to a boil. She would open the collar tomorrow. The cottage had been waiting since 1978. It would wait one more day. She did not wait until tomorrow. By 11 o'clock the next morning, the wind had come around to the northeast and was driving a hard grey rain against the seaward panes of the lamp room, and the rain on the panes sounded like fine gravel thrown at a window by hand. And Faye Wren stood at the base of the Fresnel lens with a flathead screwdriver from the kitchen drawer and a small, soft cloth she had cut from one of her own shirts, and a feeling in her chest that was not exactly impatience and not exactly fear, but something nearer to the way a person feels when she has decided that the only way to live in a house is to know what is in every room of it. The hinge in the brass collar was small, but well made. The pin that held it had been worked free and replaced many times, and the brass around it was burnished to a soft gold by the friction of fingers. She slid the blade of the screwdriver into the seam on the side opposite the hinge and turned it gently and felt the collar give. She lifted. The top half of the brass band swung up on the hidden hinge with the slow weight of something that had been counterbalanced by a craftsman who understood balance. Inside the collar, set into a shallow recess that had been milled out of the iron pedestal beneath the lens, lay a leather journal wrapped in a piece of oilcloth and a small linen pouch tied with a piece of tarred line. Faye stood very still for a long moment. The rain on the panes did not stop. The slow rainbow that had broken across the painted ceiling the morning before was gone now in the grey light, and the lamp room held only the cold and the rain sound and the small smell of brass and oil that the Fresnel had been carrying since 1978. She lifted the journal out of the recess. The leather of the cover was dry, and the spine was sound, and the small brass clasp that held it closed was tarnished, but had not corroded. She lifted the pouch. It was heavier than it looked. She did not open either of them in the lamp room. She closed the brass collar carefully and set the latch, and carried the journal and the pouch down the iron stair and through the covered walkway to the cottage and laid them on the table in the keeping room beside the kerosene lantern and the empty mug from breakfast. Then she sat down in the wooden chair at the table and looked at the two objects in the grey light from the seaward window for a long time before she opened anything. She opened the pouch first. Inside were 13 silver dollars, wrapped individually in squares of unbleached muslin, each square no larger than a child's handkerchief, each fold creased and recreased the way a piece of cloth becomes after 20 years of being opened and tied. The coins were Morgan dollars, the youngest from 1921, the oldest from 1896. They had not been collected for value, or not only for value. They had been chosen, one or two a year, by a man who understood what a silver dollar weighed in the hand, and who had wanted to leave something that could be held. A folded slip of paper at the bottom of the pouch said in pencil, in a hand that had been steady when it was young and had grown careful with age, "For the next keeper. They are not worth much. They will keep their weight when the paper money does not." O.M. Faye held one of the coins for a long time. Then she rewrapped it in its square of muslin and tied the pouch closed and set it on the table and opened the journal. The journal was bound in dark brown leather that had been oiled and re-oiled until the surface had a soft sheen, like a worn saddle. The pages were thin and cream-colored, ruled in faint blue, and the first page bore a careful inscription in the same pencil hand as the slip of paper. Owen Marchant, Keeper, Blackstone Point Light. Beginning the 17th day of October, 1955. Below the inscription was a small notation. Marjorie is 8 years old this autumn. She has begun to copy the wind directions from the log. Adele says I am to teach her the cardinal points before the snow. Faye turned the page. The entries were short and dense and written in the same careful hand. They were not the official Coast Guard log, which had been kept on the standard forms supplied by the service and turned in quarterly. This was a private record, kept on the keeper's own time in his own book, of the things the standard forms did not have a place for.
The first entry, dated the 18th of October, 1955, read, "Wind northeast all day, force 4 to 5, falling to northwest by sunset. Visibility good to the Mount Desert rock light. 3 Ida rafts working the ledge. The new lampwick from Portland is short by a 1/4 inch. I will trim and shim it tonight. Marjorie has named the herring gull that perches on the south rail Captain. She has fed him a piece of her toast at breakfast. Adele does not approve. I do not interfere." Faye read for 2 hours without stopping. The light in the keeping room went from grey to greyer as the rain settled in for the afternoon. She lit the kerosene lantern at the table at 1:30 and read on. Owen Marchant had kept the journal for 17 years, from the autumn of 1955 to the spring of 1972, when his eyes had begun to fail, and Adele had begun to do the night watches with him, and the Coast Guard had begun to talk, along this part of the Maine coast, about the next round of automations. The journal stopped on a Tuesday in May of 72 with the simple entry, "A long good run. Marjorie is 25. She has taken a teaching job in Belfast. We are alone on the point again. The light is steady. The wind is fair. There is nothing more to record today." Owen had died, Royston told her the next morning, in October of 1975. Adele had stayed in the cottage for 2 more years, with the help of a younger keeper the Coast Guard had assigned to the automated light. Then she had moved to Belfast to live near Marjorie. She had died there in 1983. Marjorie had kept the cottage through the rest of her life, coming up in summers, in autumns, in any week she could take off from the schoolhouse, and later the small museum in Belfast, where she had become the part-time archivist of the local maritime collection. She had been the one to leave the journal where Faye had found it. Royston was certain of that. He said, "Owen would not have hidden it inside the collar. Owen kept everything in the standard log box in the lamp-room cupboard. The Coast Guard never bothered the keepers about the log box. Marjorie is the one who moved it. She must have done it the year the Coast Guard came back to take the inventory, and she heard them coming and could not stand the thought of them touching it." Faye believed him. She read the journal slowly that first week, and then more slowly the second, going back to particular entries and reading them again. The technical entries she read for the technical content, because she had a watershed background and an environmental science degree, and she understood, in a way she had not expected to, the value of 40 years of one man's notes on water temperature and wave set and wind bearing in a single square mile of ocean. Owen had recorded the surface temperature of the water at the base of the ledge every morning at 6 o'clock and every evening at 6 o'clock, in degrees Fahrenheit. With a small mercury thermometer he had calibrated against a standard at the Maine Maritime Academy in 1958. He had recorded the height of the highest swell of the day with a method of his own that involved a measured rope and a fixed sighting line and a small notebook of arithmetic in the back of the journal that Faye spent 2 evenings working through before she understood what he had done. He had recorded the daily passage of fishing vessels around the point, by name and by tonnage, and by the time at which they had cleared the ledge, and the daily passage of merchant traffic, and the daily passage of pleasure boats in the brief summer season, and the appearance of every bird
he had not seen the day before. But it was the non-technical entries that took her into the second week. The day in March of 1958, when Marjorie, 10 years old, had fallen into the icy water off the boat landing while reaching for a starfish, and Owen had gone in after her with his boots on, and they had both come back to the cottage soaked through, and Adele had stripped them in the kitchen and put them under wool blankets by the cook stove, and not said a single word of reproach to either of them. The day in November of 1960, when the Coast Guard cutter Bib had passed the point in heavy weather, inbound to Eastport, and had blown her whistle 3 long blasts in greeting, and Owen had answered with the fog bell 3 times, and Adele had cried in the kitchen because the bib had been her father's last command before he had retired.
The day in 1964,
when a stranger had come up the lane on foot, with a pack on his back, and asked for water and a place to sleep, and Owen had given him both, and they had sat by the fire that evening, and the stranger had told them that he was a Korean War veteran, walking the coast of New England because he had decided, after his wife had left him, that he would either find a reason to keep walking or a reason to stop. He had stayed 3 days. He had left on the 4th, with a thermos of coffee Adele had made him, and a piece of muslin-wrapped silver dollar Owen had pressed into his palm at the gate. I have stood in the lamp room of Blackstone Point Light at 6 o'clock in the morning with Owen Marchant's journal open in my hand and the surface of the sea exactly the color he says it is in the entry for October 6th, 1957. The light moves the way he says it moves. The eider ducks work the same patch of broken water he describes them working 68 years ago. The fog comes off the Gulf the way he says the fog comes off the Gulf, in long, flat tongues that hug the water and refuse to lift until the air above them has warmed. I have read the journal 3 times. I do not pretend to understand all of it. The arithmetic for the swell height method I have copied out into a separate notebook and worked through twice, and I still find one step where his shorthand for the sighting angle is, to me, ambiguous. The local oral history disagrees with the cemetery register about the year Marjorie's mother arrived on the point. The cemetery says Adele came to Blackstone in 1946. The oral history puts it a year later. I trust the cemetery, I tell you both. The entry that took the longest, the one Faye read 4 times in 3 different sittings before she could turn the page, was the entry for the 17th of February, 1961. Owen had written it in 2 parts. The first part, dated the 17th at 11 in the morning, read, "Wind northeast, force 7, gusting to 8. Visibility under 1/4 mile. Heavy seas on the ledge." The Princess Royal, a 38-foot lobster boat out of Stonington, has gone on the southern ledge in the snow squall an hour after first light. The crew were 2. The skipper, Hollis Cushman, age 41, has come ashore on a piece of the cabin top. He is in the kitchen with Adele. I have called Southwest Harbour for the lifeboat. The second man, a deckhand whose name Hollis does not yet know me well enough to give me, did not come off the boat with him. The second part, dated the 18th at 6 in the morning, read, "The deckhand washed up at first light on the small beach east of the point. Hollis has identified him. His name was Will Sear, age 23, of Beals Island. He was working his first season with Hollis. I went down to the beach at sunrise and stayed with him until the Coast Guard launch came up from Southwest Harbour at 7:30 to take him in. Hollis sat on the granite stoop of the cottage and did not speak for 2 hours. Adele kept the cook stove going. I rang the fog bell when the launch left because it seemed wrong to let Will Sear leave the point without it. And then, 3 weeks later, on the 8th of March, the entry that Faye read 4 times. Will Sear's mother came up the lane at noon today. She is 61 years old and has buried 2 husbands and 3 of her 5 children, and now this. She brought a small wooden box with her and asked if she could carry it to the place where Will had come ashore. I walked her down. She set the box on a piece of granite above the high tide line and stood beside it for nearly 2 hours without moving. Adele watched from the kitchen window. I stood at a distance up the path. There was no wind that afternoon, which is unusual for March on this point, and the only sound was the small wash of water on the rocks and now and then a gull. When she was ready, Mrs. Sear lifted the box and carried it back to the road. She had brought it empty. She had brought it to be filled with what she could feel of him there. She nodded to me at the gate. She did not speak. She drove away in a Plymouth I would not have thought would make the climb. I have not written this in the official log. The official log records only the rescue. The official log is not the right place for the rest. Faye closed the journal at that entry the first time she read it, and went out onto the granite stoop of the cottage, and stood for a long time in the cold autumn wind, looking down at the same small beach east of the point. And she thought about Caleb, and about the trooper at the door at 7:15 in the morning, and about her own mother-in-law sitting in the Lemoyne kitchen 3 days after the funeral, telling her that the choice would come, and would feel like a choice, and would not exactly be one. She did not cry. She thought about Mrs. Sear standing on the granite for 2 hours with an empty wooden box. She understood, in a way she had not understood before, that the dead leave a shape in a place, and that the work of the living is to learn the shape and stand near it without trying to fill it in. Royston came on Wednesdays and Saturdays through October and into November. He brought tools and lumber and the small pieces of cottage that needed replacing, one at a time. They did the roof together on the first Saturday of October, working from sunrise to noon, stripping the bad asphalt back to the original cedar deck boards, and laying down a new ice and water membrane and 3 squares of architectural shingle that Royston had been holding in his barn for a job that had not happened the spring before. They primed the well on a cold Wednesday in October with a length of garden hose and a 5-gallon bucket, and a method that involved standing on the well cap and pouring water down the casing in a slow, steady stream, while the foot valve found its prime. And on the 3rd try, they got it. The water ran cold and clear and tasted of the granite the casing had been driven into 118 feet down. Royston filled the mason jar from Faye's own kitchen tap and held it up to the window and turned it slowly in the light and said, "That is the same water Owen drank for 30 years. Welcome to the point." The community came slowly, the way it comes on a Maine point in October when there is no summer crowd to hide behind. Adele Penny, who was no relation to Adele Marchant, but had been told, when she was a young woman, that she had been named for her, drove out the 2nd week with a casserole dish of haddock baked in milk and a small jar of her own bread-and-butter pickles. She was 68 years old, a retired nurse, widowed 3 years earlier herself, and she sat in the keeping room with Faye for an hour and did not ask a single question about Caleb. She talked about the haddock recipe, which had been her mother's, and about the proper way to bake it, which involved a slice of salt pork on the top to keep the milk from skinning. She left at the end of the hour with the empty mason jar she had insisted on bringing back to her own pantry, and the quiet promise that she would come again in 2 weeks. She did. Mason Tibbets, a lobsterman in his late 50s who fished the ledge south of the point, came up the lane in a rust-spotted Chevy pickup on the second Saturday of November and stood at the door with his cap in his hand and said he had heard there was a woman at the cottage and he wanted to introduce himself before the winter started, in case she needed anything. He gave her his phone number on a scrap of paper torn from the back of a bait receipt and a 5-pound bag of mussels he had pulled from the ledge that morning. He showed her the radio frequency to monitor for storm warnings and the marine VHF channel his boat ran on, and the small bay east of the point where the cell signal could be coaxed into life if she stood on a particular rock at high tide. He did not stay for coffee. He came back twice more before Christmas. Sarah Doucette, who ran the library in Hancock on the 3 days a week it was open, came out on a cold Tuesday in early December with 3 boxes of books she had pulled from the back room of the library, where the older donations sat unsorted. She had heard from Eldon Yates that there was a new resident at Blackstone Point, and she had thought, looking at the unsorted boxes, that some of them might be worth bringing out. They were maritime histories of the Maine coast. They were a complete set of the Maine Lighthouse Service annual reports from 1904 through 1939, which had been donated by the family of a former Lighthouse Service supply officer who had died in 1971. They were a worn copy of Charles Dickens's American Notes that Sarah said had been at the library for 50 years and never once been borrowed, and might as well live somewhere it would be read. She helped Faye carry the boxes into the keeping room and stayed for tea, and asked Faye whether she had read any of the journal. Faye told her she had. Sarah nodded slowly. She said, "Owen Marchant was my mother's second cousin. My mother used to talk about him. She said he had a way of paying attention that most people did not have. She said she had thought of him every time the lighthouse came up in conversation, even after the Coast Guard automated it." She paused. Then she said, "You will want to be careful with the journal. You will want to keep it dry. If you ever decide you do not want to be the one to keep it, the Penobscot Marine Museum has been asking after his papers for 20 years. They would treat it well." Faye said she would think about it. She walked Sarah out to her car at the top of the lane. The afternoon was already darkening, the sun setting at 4 o'clock in early December, and the wind was coming up out of the northwest, the way it does before a storm in the Gulf, and there was a smell on the wind that Royston had taught her to recognize. The cold, flat smell of snow gathering somewhere out over the open water. The storm came on the night of the 11th of December. It came hard and fast, the way down east storms come in winter, with the wind backing from northwest to north to northeast in the span of 2 hours, and the temperature falling from 28 to 14, and the rain that had started at sundown turning by midnight to a hard pellet snow that drove sideways against the seaward panes of the cottage. Faye had banked the cook stove at 10, and the wood-burning fireplace in the keeping room at 11, and the cottage was holding its small warmth. But the wind in the chimney was a steady, low note, like a man humming through his teeth, and the cottage joints creaked, and the spray that came over the southern ledge in the worst gusts was reaching all the way to the south wall of the cottage and freezing on the cedar shingles in a slow, accumulating glaze. Faye lay on the cot in the keeping room with the wool blanket over her, and listened to the storm and to the small, frantic mechanical pulse of the aluminium beacon out on the rock, the only sound that did not change in storm or calm. The Coast Guard's mute insistence that something on this point still worked. She got up at 2 in the morning to put another piece of split oak on the fireplace and to look out the seaward window. The catwalk light on the tower was on. She had not turned it on. She had not, in 3 months on the point, ever turned it on. She stood in the keeping room in her wool socks and her grandfather's cardigan, with the firelight behind her and the storm against the panes in front of her, and watched the small, steady yellow square of light at the top of the tower. The small, steady yellow square that was coming from inside the lamp room, behind the Fresnel. Then the light moved. It was Royston. Faye understood it before she had finished pulling her boots on. The aluminium mast beacon at the corner of the rock was a Coast Guard fixed installation that no one came out to in a storm at 2 in the morning unless a vessel was in trouble close to the point. Royston had a marine VHF receiver in the kitchen of his house on the next point south. He kept it on. He had heard something on it. He had come the 4 miles in the storm and the dark, either by truck, as far as the truck would go, and on foot from there, or all the way on foot if the drifting had been bad enough to close the lane, because something on the radio had told him to come. She pulled her father's wool sweater over her own, and her oilskin over the sweater, and stepped out of the cottage into the storm. The wind hit her in the chest and pushed her sideways, and she set her shoulder against it and walked the 11 steps of the covered walkway to the tower door. The door was unlatched. She pushed it open and climbed the stair and lifted the hatch and stood in the lamp room. And Royston was at the seaward pane with a small flashlight in his hand and the marine VHF radio from his truck on the floor beside him, and a chart of the southern ledge unrolled on the iron pedestal beneath the lens. He looked at her once. He said, "There is a 36-foot scalloper a 1/4 mile off the southern ledge with a fouled propeller and a man in the wheelhouse with no radar. The Coast Guard launch is at the mouth of Frenchman Bay. They cannot raise her in this for 40 minutes. I came up here because the Fresnel still works." She did not understand at first. She looked at the lens that had not been turned on in 1978. The lens that the Coast Guard had decommissioned, but had left in place because the cost of removing it had exceeded the cost of leaving it. Royston pointed to the small lamp at the base of the pedestal. It was an oil-burning lamp of the kind the old service had used in keeper installations of this size, and that Owen Marchant had kept in working order, with replacement wicks and a small spare can of fuel in the cupboard at the back of the lamp room, against a rule of the regulations of the service for which no one had ever found a reason to discipline him. Royston had taken the burner out of the cupboard. He had filled it from the spare can. He had set it on the pedestal beneath the lens. He had lit it. The flame was small and yellow and very steady. The Fresnel, on its iron pedestal, drew the small yellow flame and broke it across the prisms and threw a beam through the seaward pane that was, even in the snow, strong enough to walk on. The beam swept the southern ledge once every 12 seconds because Royston had hand-turned the lens through its first revolution and had set the clockwork of the rotation mechanism which Owen had kept oiled into the 1970s into its old, patient gear. She stood in the lamp room and watched the beam sweep the snow and the dark water and the small white patch a 1/4 mile out, where the scalloper was making its slow way toward the open of the bay. She watched the scalloper turn into the beam and watched it correct its heading by perhaps 8 degrees, and watched it pass the southern ledge with 20 yards to spare and stand off into deep water. She watched the Coast Guard launch come around the headland at 3:40 in the morning with its blue light on and take the scalloper under tow. She watched the launch and the scalloper move slowly together back toward the lights of Hancock and disappear into the snow. Then she sat down on the floor of the lamp room, with her back against the iron pedestal, and she cried, for the first time since the funeral, with the small yellow flame of the oil lamp above her head, and Royston Mears beside her, with one hand on her shoulder, until the storm began to lift at 4 in the morning, and the wind began to ease, and the snow began to gentle, and she had cried herself out. Royston put the kettle on the cook stove in the kitchen. He made tea for both of them. They sat at the table and drank it without speaking. When the cup was empty, he stood up and put on his oilskin and said, "I will be back at noon. The lens will need to be cleaned. I should not have run it without cleaning it first. Owen would have been displeased." He said it without smiling. He let himself out the kitchen door. Faye heard the truck start a long way down the lane. She heard it pull away. She sat at the table until the dawn came up grey and clean over the Gulf, with the storm gone and the sea flattened out, and the eider ducks already at work on the southern ledge. The Coast Guard never asked. The scalloper's name was the Eastern Star out of Stonington, and her captain was a man named Tobias Crowley, and he had told the launch crew, when they took him under tow, that he had been about to put her on the southern ledge in the snow when the Blackstone Point light had come on, and the launch crew had not bothered to correct him, because the launch crew knew the Blackstone Point light had not been operational since '78, and had assumed the man had seen the aluminium beacon and confused himself in the dark. The official record of that night, filed at the Coast Guard station at Southwest Harbour on the morning of the 12th of December, noted only a fouled prop call and a routine tow. Royston came at noon, as he had said. They cleaned the Fresnel together. They emptied the lamp and put it back in the cupboard. They wiped down the brass collar and set the pedestal as it had been. Royston rolled up the chart of the southern ledge and put it back in the canvas tool bag and said, "We will not do that again unless we have to. The Coast Guard does not need to know. The light does not need to know. The light has its own opinion." Faye nodded. She understood the protocol now. The lamp room had its own protocol. The lamp room had had its own protocol since 1955. She spent the rest of December and most of January working on the cottage. The roof was done. The well was good. The cook stove and the fireplace were sound. What remained was the long inside work that a 640-square-foot cottage on a Maine point requires to be lived in through a winter and a spring and a summer and another winter. She did the walls first. She and Royston pulled the original lath and plaster off the keeping room wall behind the settle, which had been failing for years, and rebuilt the wall with 2 layers of vapor-permeable wood sheathing, 4 inches of closed-cell foam insulation between the studs, and a finish of cedar beadboard that Royston had been saving in his barn from a job at a summer house on Sorrento Sound that had come down in the 1998 ice storm. They reglazed the 4 windows on the seaward side, which had been single pane in their original putty since 1911, with new wood storms milled to the original profile by a man Royston knew in Bucksport who still cut window stock from white pine on a small mill behind his house. They replaced the cloth-wrapped wiring with new sheathed cable through the original conduits, ran a new line for the kitchen, set a small breaker panel in the back hall, and pulled a single grounded outlet for the kerosene lantern's electric replacement in each room. They did not put a television in the cottage. Faye did not want one. They did not put a refrigerator in the cottage. The cook stove and the cold pantry off the kitchen, which faced north and held the cold of the Maine winter as the granite of the point held it, were enough. She put a small composting toilet in the back hall, behind a curtain. She put a freshwater hand pump beside the soapstone sink that drew from a new buried cistern fed by both the well and the rain. She bought a small marine-grade solar panel on the recommendation of a man at the Penobscot Marine Museum in Searsport, where she had driven on a clear Saturday in late January with the journal wrapped in a piece of muslin in the passenger seat, and she mounted the panel on the south wall of the cottage where the morning sun would catch it, and ran the wires through to a small bank of 2 deep-cycle batteries in a sealed cabinet beneath the kitchen floor. She painted the keeping room ceiling and the keeping room walls a soft white she had mixed herself from a base in the hardware store in Ellsworth, with a small drop of yellow ochre stirred in to keep the white from going blue in the winter light. She painted the kitchen the color of the inside of an oyster shell. She painted the back hall a deep dark blue that, when Royston came to inspect it, made him stand for a long moment in the doorway and say only, "That is the color of the Gulf at 4 in the afternoon in January. You have an eye." The cottage came back to life slowly. The settle in the keeping room got a new wool cushion that Adele Penny had sewn from a bolt of plaid she had been saving for 40 years. The window seat in the bay got a small rag rug that Sarah Doucette had brought out from the back of the library, along with 3 more boxes of books. The bed in the corner of the keeping room, where the cot had stood, became a proper iron frame bed with a horsehair mattress that Royston had pulled out of a cousin's barn and reticked over a long Saturday in February. The kitchen got a small drop-leaf table with 2 chairs that had been Owen Marchant's, which Sarah had retrieved from the back room of the Historical Society in Belfast, where Marjorie had left them in 1993, and which the Society had been holding without quite knowing what to do with them. The chairs were maple, handmade, with the initials O.M. and A.M. carved into the underside of each seat in careful, small letters that Faye did not find for 2 weeks after the chairs arrived. The community came in the same way the cottage came back, slowly, in small, useful pieces. Adele Penny came every other Tuesday with a casserole or a soup and stayed an hour, and left with the empty mason jar she had brought the time before. She talked about her late husband, who had been a fisheries inspector for the state of Maine for 31 years, and about her work as a nurse at the small hospital in Ellsworth for 28 years before that, and about her 2 grown daughters, one in Portland and one in Albuquerque. She did not, in all the weeks of those visits, ever once mention Caleb by name. She made room around him without naming him, which Faye understood as a kind of care that the people of the Maine coast had developed in places where weather and water had been taking husbands for 300 years, and the survivors had had to learn what to say and what not to say. Mason Tibbets brought her mussels twice in January, and a 5-pound sack of his own cooked and shelled lobster meat in February, packed in clear ice in a small cooler he had brought out for the purpose. He taught her how to read the storm warnings on the VHF and how to set a length of 3-strand twisted nylon as a snubber on the line of the cottage's small wooden skiff, which had been Owen's, which Royston had brought down from his own barn in March, and which Fay had been keeping tied to the small landing at the foot of the southern path. Mason fished the ledge year-round, as his father had, and his grandfather before that, and he had been fishing the ledge long enough to know it the way Owen had known the surface of the water from the lamp room. He brought Fay a chart of his own at the end of February, hand-corrected with pencil marks for the seasonal movements of the lobster bottom around the point. He said, "You will not be fishing it, but you should know what is under your water." Sarah Doucette brought the boxes of the Lighthouse Service annual reports back to the cottage in 3 trips that spring, and stayed each time to drink tea and to look through the journal with Fay, and to talk about Owen and Adele and Marjorie, whom Sarah had known as a child. She said that Marjorie had been a teacher in Belfast for 31 years and had taught Sarah herself in the 3rd grade, in 1978, the year the Coast Guard had automated the light. She said that Marjorie had brought a small framed photograph of the lamp room into the classroom that year, and had hung it on the wall above her desk, and had not taken it down for the rest of her career. She said that Marjorie had spoken in her last years about wanting the cottage to come to someone who would know to look behind the brass collar. Sarah had asked her, the last time she had visited Marjorie before the end, how Marjorie had thought such a person would know. Marjorie had said, in the way that Marjorie had of saying things, "She will not know. She will look. The looking is the thing." By March, the Penobscot Marine Museum in Searsport had offered Fay a modest annual stipend of $3,200 in exchange for the curation of Owen Marchant's papers, which she was to keep at the cottage in a small archival cabinet they had agreed to ship her, and to make available to visiting scholars on a schedule of her own setting, and to add to as her own observations of the point accumulated. She had begun her own notebook in November, on a small piece of unlined cream-laid paper she had bought at the stationer's in Bar Harbor, bound between 2 pieces of cedar she had cut from a piece of Royston's barn. She wrote in it every morning and every evening at 6 o'clock, as Owen had written, with a mercury thermometer she had borrowed from the Maine Maritime Academy, and had calibrated against Owen's old standard from the lamp room. The water temperatures she recorded were almost exactly 2 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than Owen's records for the same calendar dates in 1962, which the museum had told her was consistent with 60 years of warming in the Gulf of Maine, and which the museum had said her continuing record would help to document. She had begun to write, in the same notebook, accounts of the days. Not the rescue, which she had not described to anyone but Royston, and which neither of them had ever spoken about again, but the small things. The day in January when Mason Tibbets had stood in the keeping room and shown her how to splice an eye into the end of a piece of 3-strand twisted nylon, his hands moving with the slow, patient competence of a man who had been doing the same splice for 40 years. The day in February when Adele Penny had told her, over a bowl of haddock chowder, about the night her own husband had died in his sleep in their bed in the small white house in Ellsworth in 1973, on a Wednesday, with no warning and no apparent reason, and how Adele had lain beside him for an hour before she had called anyone because she had wanted that hour. The day in March when Sarah Doucette had brought out from the library a small photograph of Owen Marchant, taken in 1968, standing at the seaward door of the lamp room with the Fresnel behind him, and the morning sun on his shoulders, and his face turned 3/4 away from the camera, looking out at the gulf with the small private expression of a man who has been left alone in a place he understands. The photograph went into a small wooden frame Royston had made for it, and onto the mantel above the fireplace in the keeping room, beside the framed photograph of Caleb in his Coast Guard whites that Fay had brought from the rented Cape in Lemoyne. It is worth saying plainly what kind of place this is and what kind of life it offers. By the count of the United States Lighthouse Society, there are several hundred standing historic lighthouses on the coasts and Great Lakes of the United States, and the Coast Guard still actively maintains the optics of a great many of them for navigational purposes. The towers themselves are owned in roughly equal measure by the Coast Guard, by state governments, by municipalities, by non-profit preservation groups, and by private individuals who, under the National Historic Lighthouse Preservation Act of 2000, have acquired them under a provision that requires only the assumption of maintenance responsibility and a covenant of preservation. The keepers' cottages, where they survive, came through a different chain of title. Some, like the cottage at Blackstone Point, went to the families of the last keepers under one or another quiet arrangement of the late 1970s, when the later rounds of automation took the last full-time keepers off the rocks. Those families, in many cases, have held them since. Some are still held. A few, like the one at Blackstone Point, have been passed by deed and by intention to a stranger. There is no easy way to find out which ones are available. The towns and the small county courthouses of Down East Maine, of the Olympic Peninsula, of the Outer Banks of North Carolina, of the Apostle Islands of Lake Superior, of the Rocky Points of the Oregon coast and the Sound Country of Puget, hold the records of those transfers in folders that no one has thought to digitize, and that no one will think to digitize for as long as the people who know what is in them are still alive to be asked. The Penobscot Marine Museum maintains a small reference room in Searsport, where some of the records of the Maine coast can be looked at. The U.S. Lighthouse Society maintains a national index. The records are not secret. They are only quiet, and the lives that the cottages will hold for the people who find their way to them are quiet too. They are not for everyone. They are for the person who has decided that the work of keeping a small thing safe in a hard place is a sufficient occupation for the years that remain to her. They are for the person who is willing to learn the shape of the dead and to stand near it without trying to fill it in. The spring came late that year. Royston said it always came late on the point, 2 weeks behind the inland country, because the cold water of the Gulf held the air against itself until the calendar said April, and the calendar would not be argued with. The eider ducks left the southern ledge on the 17th of April, the same day Owen had recorded their departure in 1964. The first cormorant returned on the 22nd of April. The first osprey nest on the platform Royston had built on the Spar Buoy a quarter-mile out was occupied by the 3rd of May, by what was probably the same pair that had used it the year before. Fay recorded each one. The water temperature at 6 in the morning on the 1st of May was 41 degrees Fahrenheit. Owen's reading for the same date in 1965 had been 39. She marked the difference in the margin of her own notebook in pencil, as he had marked his. She took the journal to Marjorie Marchant's grave in the cemetery in Belfast on a clear morning in early May. Sarah Doucette had told her where it was, in the small, old part of the cemetery near the back fence, beside the graves of Owen and Adele.
Faye stood at the foot of the three graves for a long time in the spring sun.
Marjorie had died at 75. Adele had died at 81. Owen had died at 68. Owen's stone said only, Owen Marchant, Keeper, Blackstone Point Light, 1907 to 1975. Below the name was the small carved outline of a lantern. Faye laid the journal on the grass at the foot of the stone for a moment and then picked it up again. She had not come to leave it. She had only come to bring it to him. She drove back to Hancock in the afternoon with the windows of the Subaru open and the smell of the new salt marsh coming up off the flats at the head of Frenchman Bay, and the journal on the passenger seat beside her, where Caleb's spare uniform had hung for 2 years in a dry cleaning bag from a hook in the doorframe that was no longer there. She had not, in all of this, become someone else. She had not, in the way the magazines that come to the post office in Hancock and that nobody in Hancock reads describe these things, transformed her life or reinvented her identity or found her purpose. She had simply moved. She had moved from a rented cape on the backside of Lemoyne to a keeper's cottage on a rock on the coast of Maine. And she had brought her grief with her, because grief is not a thing a person leaves behind by changing addresses. And she had set the grief down on the granite stoop of the cottage beside the small wooden skiff that had been Owen's. And she had let the granite and the wind and the cold water of the Gulf and the slow attention of the people who came up the lane in their pickup trucks with casseroles and mussels and books take it apart, very slowly, over the course of a winter and a spring, until it was the shape that grief becomes when it has had time. Not gone, not transformed, only shaped, the way a piece of granite is shaped by the water that has run over it for 100 years. In June, on the first anniversary of Caleb's death, she went down to the small beach east of the point at sunrise and sat on the granite above the high tide line where Will Sears' mother had sat for 2 hours in 1961. The morning was calm. The water was glass flat and the color of pewter, and the eider ducks, which had returned to the ledge for their summer feeding, were working a patch of broken water about 30 yards from the rocks. She had brought with her a small wooden box, about the size of a recipe box, made of mahogany, which had been Caleb's mother's grandmother's, and which Caleb's mother had given Faye on the last day of her visit after the funeral, with the note that whatever Faye wanted to put in it would be the right thing. Faye opened the box. She had been putting things in it for a year. A piece of folded paper from the chaplain at the funeral, a small enamel pin from Caleb's first ship, the $2 bill he had carried in his wallet since basic training, a photograph of him and Faye at the marine supply store in Bar Harbor on the third afternoon they had known each other, taken by the owner with a small Polaroid kept under the cash register for occasions of his own determining. She closed the box. She sat with it on her lap for a long time. She did not put it in the water. She did not bury it. She carried it back to the cottage and put it on the shelf above the kitchen window, beside the wooden recipe box that had been Caleb's mother's. The two boxes sat side by side. They were almost the same size. They were the same dark mahogany. They held different things, and the same thing. In July, the first visitors came to look at the journal. A botanist from the University of Maine in Orono came up on a Wednesday to examine the bird records. A graduate student in marine science from the University of New Hampshire came on a Friday to copy the water temperature series into a spreadsheet she had been compiling for a regional warming study. A woman from the Maine Maritime Academy came on a Saturday with the original mercury thermometer Owen had calibrated his against in 1958. In a small wooden case the Academy had kept it in since his death, and asked Faye if Faye would like to have it. Faye said she would. She put the thermometer in the cupboard at the back of the lamp room, where Owen had kept his. In August, she had a small piece of writing accepted by a quarterly journal that printed the kind of careful prose that quarterlies in their last years still print. It was about an old oil-burning lamp. She did not say in the piece what she had used it for. She said only that she had learned, on a winter night on the coast of Maine, that the equipment of the old service had been built to keep working for as long as someone remained to work it, and that this was not a sentimental observation, but a structural one. The piece ran 6 pages. She was paid $425. She used the check to buy a new oilskin and a second wool sweater, and she had $273 left over, which she put in the coffee can her father had given her in 1998. It is November now, as I write this, a year and a season after Faye Wren paid $1 and the back taxes on the keeper's cottage at Blackstone Point Light. The roof is sound. The well is good. The walls are tight. The Fresnel lens stands on its iron pedestal in the lamp room, with the brass collar latched and the small kerosene burner in the cupboard at the back of the room, and the small wooden box in the cupboard beside it,